Hello, good afternoon, and good morning. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss our annual environmental risk outlook. My name is Stacey Gilfillan, Head of Sustainability Content and Campaign here at Verisk Maplecroft, and I'll be moderating the webinar today from London. I'll give a brief introduction to Verisk Maplecroft and provide a little housekeeping, then I'd like to hand it over to my environmental colleagues. For those of you who may not know us, here at Maplecroft, we believe in simplifying complex issues. We specialize in quantifying risk exposure on a global scale in 4 thematic areas: political risk, human rights, economics, and relevant to today's webinar, we cover over 50 environmental risk issues. Our data and unique holistic approach support a range of clients in performing supplier and site risk assessments, CDP and sustainability reports, climate scenario analysis, due diligence, and portfolio management. I'm delighted now to introduce today's panelists. Will Nichols, Head of Environment, and Liz Hypes, one of our environmental analysts, both based in our New York office. Will, environmental issues have been steadily moving up on the corporate and investor agenda, but also they are now such a firm fixture in mainstream media. Can you tell us a little bit about the environmental risk outlook and how you decided to pick these topics for 2019?
Sure, Stacey, and hi to everyone who's joining us today. Well, the environment risk outlook it's really a response to people coming to us and wanting to know what's coming down the line that's going to affect their business. So this is the second or third year we've done this, and we've looked at 3 or 4 discrete risk issues. Typically, these are issues that have been sort of bubbling up over the previous year, and we think are poised to really go mainstream or have a real material impact on businesses over the coming year. So this time round, on the corporate side, we've covered the climate disclosure gap and post-2020 sustainability targets, and I'll be going over those in more detail in next week's webinar, which will give details about signing up to at the end. But today is very much a tale of 2 crises. We'll get onto plastic waste later, but we'll start with air pollution. So we've seen in the past year a whole host of reports really confirming the link between poor air pollution and health risks. So we've seen the WHO, for example, now saying that maybe 9 out of 10 people breathe polluted air, and that kills 7 million people every year. I mean, these are huge impacts. A third of global deaths from strokes, from lung cancer, from heart disease are all due to air pollution. This is, numbers equivalent to smoking. And we've seen on the news, you've seen Airmageddon in Beijing that sparked an awful lot of headlines. We've seen issues in India as well. And that is clearly one of the major sources of the problem is Asia. And you can see from our air quality index map here. So this measures PM 2.5, and it's taken from satellite data. And you can see all the red areas there. Those are the extreme risk areas. So as you'd expect, there's issues all over India, all over China. And a lot of that is driven by things like, obviously, use of coal power. There's a lot of old vehicles over there as well. So we can look at those factors towards creating issues, particularly in urban areas. But I think what's interesting to note is whilst we do have these big, large red areas in India and China, you can really see there's a lot of a few hotspots elsewhere. So we can see Eastern Europe, you can see Northern Italy, probably due to the Alps. And one of the big, perhaps overlooked risks or areas of risk is in Africa, Central Africa. And Liz has joined me today. Is there a particular reason why we're looking at risks in Africa?
Definitely. And I think when we talk about air quality in Africa, it's important to note that air quality data is lacking or limited, but what we are seeing collected over the last few decades is showing a growing crisis. Between 1993 and 2013, outdoor air pollution in Africa increased a staggering 36%. And experts say that if this trend continues, the health crisis is going to be on par with that of China and India. So it's definitely an area of concern. And I actually thought the statistic of 27% of countries in Africa were at extreme risk. So I looked into our air quality index, and saw that in the top 25 most at-risk countries, 7 of them were in Africa, and leading the way was DR Congo and Congo. And the issues for why air pollution is becoming a crisis in Africa is the same as why it is a crisis elsewhere. You have urbanization and related traffic and congestion, which is compounded by the fact that most African countries don't have fuel standards in place. And then you also have continued reliance on coal for power generation, and then extreme industry growth, particularly in high-emitting sectors like mining.
And what the trends that Liz was talking about there, you can really see in some of the work that we've done towards the ERO. So whilst we've looked at areas in our extreme risk and high risk in our air quality index and mapped that against urban population growth. So you can see by 2035, we're going to have almost 1 billion people living in areas of extreme risk according to our air quality index. That's an increase of around 300 million people. And as expected, the real sort of bulk of population growth is in India and China. But what's interesting, I think, here is, as Liz referred to, is perhaps these overlooked risks in places like DR Congo and Congo, where there's perhaps the numbers aren't as high, but you can really see the proportional increase is very significant.
Thanks for that, Will. Yeah, and Liz, I guess with the rate of urbanization set to continue and these city dwellers are going to be at increased risk, are you seeing how governments and regulators might be trying to address this challenge?
Definitely. We've seen a number of direct regulatory responses popping up last year and expect it to continue going on, particularly in 2019 and moving forward. These include low emission zones. London and Maplecroft's hometown of Bath have implemented low emission zones, and they're particularly targeting children's health issues resulting from air pollution. We've seen diesel bans cropping up across Europe and even in Africa. In the last couple of years, countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda have placed bans on all fuels but low sulfur fuels. Coal plant retirements last year was an almost all-time high for coal plant retirements in North America, in the US and North America. We're seeing it across Asia and Europe as well. And then SNAP factory shutdowns and crackdown on enforcement, I think, is something we're seeing quite heavily in China. In its 3-year plan, which we love the name of, is winning the Blue Sky War. But it's a bit of a back and forth with regulators, and I think, Will, you can talk a little bit more to that.
Yeah, absolutely, and this is absolutely right to highlight. There's been an awful lot of responses here, and part of that I think is driven, especially in places like China and Southeast Asia, by an emerging middle class who simply aren't going to take this. They're not happy with the deal that development can continue at the cost of the environment. That's not something they are going to maintain, that kind of social contract. And you see President Xi has his beautiful China 2035 policy. There's a whole number of regulations under that aegis, which is driving China towards cleaner air. But at the same time, we do have an awfully large investment in coal development, not just in China. You can see that we've got some stats on India as well there, which is putting an awful lot of money towards funding coal. Even here in the EU, we're not immune to that by any means. You'd have thought that, as Liz mentioned, we've got a lot of regulations coming forward in the EU, but equally we are putting money towards coal research at the same time. And where Liz and I are sitting right now in the US, obviously there's been an awful lot made by President Trump about trying to support coal, trying to advance it, bring it back into the energy mix with decidedly mixed success. I mean, I think it's difficult to bring coal back for a number of economic factors as well as environmental factors. But you can see that whilst you might expect there to be more of a uniform push towards regulation, actually we're seeing a real mixed bag of legislation.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Will, to see that at the moment it's such a patchwork, kind of non-uniform way of trying to deal with this problem. Liz, how are companies addressing this problem, in a way that maybe governments aren't? Is their exposure to reputational damage dependent on the size of their carbon footprint and the contribution they're making to air pollution?
Yeah, and I think a lot of companies may not have to be the highest emitters to be targeted because of their high visibility. I'm seeing this in my research in Africa, particularly in the mining industry. Illegal mines often occur within proximity to licensed mines, and they're some of the biggest polluters. And because of that, because of their proximity to licensed operations, they're being targeted by local communities, by NGOs, and as well as even resulting in some regulatory and legal responses. And I think this can be, an issue, particularly for ICT sectors who rely on mineral mining, and even with regards to sort of that supply chain risk coming up the chain there. And I think, though, that there are definitely ways that companies are working to address this and can, kind of work to combat and mitigate these reputational risks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that companies can do is report on these things, track these things, which most companies are doing. It's rare to find a large company that isn't sort of reporting on this kind of stuff. But and there are many places through which companies can do that as well. A lot of the issue, we think, is kind of around data. I mean, we mentioned our kind of air quality index at the beginning. That's one of a number of tools that companies can use to look at where they might be most exposed, whether that's through their operational sites, whether that's through their supply chains. You can kind of make, obviously, comparisons of where you are sited now, where you could potentially go, and see which ones might be able to reduce the risk of your portfolio. Of course, we have a lot of companies come to us and say, well, look, we can see tier one, but beyond that, it's a bit of a blind spot for us. It's really difficult to sort of push these values down the supply chain. So, other companies that we've seen have introduced codes of conduct. They've introduced kind of limits into supply chain deals as well that kind of make sure that your values are pushed down the value chain as far as you need to. And finally, there are also more technological options as well. So we find that a lot of companies who are affected by poor air pollution are those that are in the logistics sector. They're supply chain companies, who are perhaps being prevented from entering certain areas of cities at certain times, or their fleets are coming under regulations in terms of emissions. So other things to consider are alternative fuels, whether that's electric, whether that's natural gas, any of these things that might have an impact on reducing the amount of harmful pollution in the atmosphere.
Great, thanks. There's obviously a lot of different activities and things to consider depending on what companies are actually doing, whether it's something that they're contributing to, or whether it's something that they're just going to be perceived to be contributing to. So that's interesting to see those things that are worth considering. I guess, Will, turning now to the other topic that we are going to cover today, plastics. It should come as no surprise to anyone on the webinar that this is kind of the key topic for 2019. Can you give us a snapshot of the mounting plastics crisis?
Sure, absolutely. And I think you're right, Stacey. I don't think anyone on the call won't have heard of issues around plastics. But we should probably say right up front that, plastics obviously gets a bad press, but it's an incredibly useful material. It's very durable. It can be used in all number of different ways. The real issue with plastic is its disposal. So, I mean, we've got some stats here. You can see 8 million tons of plastic entering the ocean every year. And, on current trends, we're going to be producing an extra 26 billion tons of plastic waste by 2050. These are huge amounts. And I think the sort of worrying side of things of this is that a lot of that plastic is going to be produced or consumed in areas like Asia, which just simply don't have the waste management infrastructure to be able to cope with the huge influx. I mean, we've already seen China has started to reject plastic waste imports and other waste imports. I mean, part of that is to do with Beautiful China policy, but part of it is simply that it doesn't want to have to deal with this kind of stuff. And we've seen its neighbors as well. I think Malaysia, Thailand have gone down similar routes as well. So the real risk here for companies is you may think that you've disposed of your plastics appropriately. It's been taken away by a truck, but actually you don't really have any idea where it goes after that. I mean, previously, if it was going to China to be dealt with, then fine, but now you don't know where that plastic might end up, and there's a real risk that a bottle with your company's name on it is going to be floating past a dead sea turtle or something like that, and that's just going to bring in huge reputational risks and brand damage on that front. So we can see a little bit that regulators have started to step up on this, and I think there's a couple drivers behind this. Obviously the real sort of rise to prominence of plastics really only in the last couple of years, which has been fueled by programs like Planet Earth 2, for example, in the UK. Some of the programs over here in the US as well have focused on it. And that's put pressure on regulators to step up into this. So we've mentioned sort of China, Thailand, Malaysia, how they're restricting waste imports. Even over here in the US, President Trump has put money towards ocean cleanups and called on other nations. There's several recycling schemes that have been launched here as well. The UK and Europe are kind of leading this. There's talk about banning single-use plastics almost by next year already. And I think that's really kind of interesting one. And Liz, perhaps you can give us an idea of where we are with plastic in Africa as well.
Sure. I think as this map indicates, there's definitely a regulatory response going on in Africa. A fair number of countries are following suit and issuing plastic bag bans, single-use bans. But I thought this was really interesting is that Africa wants to be the first plastic-free continent. And a handful of countries have partnered with the UN Environment to create an initiative called Beat Plastic Pollution, and another one called Clean Seas, which looks at sort of plastic waste in oceans. And I think from that, we're going to see a lot more regulations coming forward on plastic waste in Africa.
Great. So we've obviously seen now how regulators are starting to step up, and I guess I'd like to hear a little bit about what companies are actually doing in this space. I know you've seen a lot of things in the media, and also just in other environmental issues where there's a kind of regulation gap. You start to see a lot of leadership come from businesses. So, Will, can you just highlight some of those for us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like you say, Stacey, we're starting to see business leadership on this front as well. And part of that, of course, is the pressure from consumers. Part of it's regulators, but we can also look at things like shareholders as well, which are going to be really pushing this. We flagged three there. I mean, obviously, these are three of the most iconic brands that you could possibly think about. And the action that these guys are taking is highly visible. It's kind of demanded by their customers. And it could make an impact. These guys have huge supply chains. I think where else we're seeing a bit of action is actually sort of in the background on the producer front. So we know that most of the major producers of plastic are oil and gas companies, and you can see even in the last few months they've started this Alliance to End Plastic Waste. It includes a number of oil majors, a few chemical companies as well, and they're pledging $1 billion over the next 5 years to look at how we can try and tackle this problem, whether that's cleaning up the plastic waste or developing things around the circular economy, which relates to how we design products and what materials go into those products, whether they're recyclable, whether they can be recycled at the end of their life. So you can see there's a real coming together of companies to try and address this. And I think with companies looking to address it, this has brought it also onto investors' radars as well. So we've seen Norway's sovereign wealth fund is starting to examine its exposure to plastic producing and plastic packaging. And I'd be absolutely amazed if they were the only investors to start doing that. We expect something like that to start trickling down through the economy. At some of the conferences I attended last year, people were saying that actually using plastics might be socially unacceptable even within 5 years, which is an incredible timeline. I mean, that's sort of quicker than tobacco, quicker than a lot of these other issues that have flown forward. So it's something that there's a real momentum behind.
And,
Are there any?
oh,
Oh,
I was
sorry.
just going to add on to what Will is saying about investor pressure. I think it's going to continue to mount on companies and brands with a background in corporate governance and proxy voting. I saw firsthand, I mean, all three of these companies listed here have been targeted by shareholder proposals. And we saw those trends increasing in the industry, and it's going to probably amplify more in 2019 season and going forward. And I'm sure a name that won't surprise a few people on this call, a share advocacy group called As You Sow, has created a group called the Plastic Solutions Investor Alliance. It's made up of 25 institutional investors and represents $1 trillion in assets. And its sole purpose is going forward and starting in 2019 is to engage companies on packaging and plastic waste. So I think their leadership is being very welcomed, and that sort of direct engagement with investors is going to be amplified this year.
Great. So yeah, you can really see a real momentum starting to build up to address this challenge. Were there any final thoughts, anything around specifics that companies can be doing to address this on a more kind of local level?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think perhaps even before we get to that, I mean, one of the sort of issues here is we flagged at the beginning, if plastic is difficult to replace, it's a really, really useful thing to do, useful thing to have. Plus, we've got the huge, just the enormous amount of plastic waste that's being generated. So for any one company, it's a huge problem. This is why we think we're going to see more and more of these kind of alliances of companies coming together to try and address these kind of issues, because just the scale of investment that's needed is absolutely enormous. We've flagged up a few areas there where companies can kind of look to address this. So, I mean, the key one, perhaps at the beginning, is what do people want you to do? What do the people who invested in your company want you to address? What is material to your business plan? And once you've kind of decided that, how are you going to go about doing this? What's preventing you from addressing this problem? And part of the problem sometimes is things like data again, and we have a couple of indices that we brought forward to try and look at this. So we have a waste management indices, we have a waste generation index as well, which is recently released, which has an element of plastic waste generation in it as well. And we're also looking at developing a recycling index as well. So there's a few of the things we're looking at to try and help our clients address these kind of problems. And then again, I think there's the kind of technological side of things. Are alternative packaging materials, are they there? Are they ready? Can you bring them forward? Can you have them in large scale? This is, I think, an issue that an awful lot of companies are struggling with, that simply the alternatives aren't coming forward fast enough for them to make the shift that consumers and shareholders are demanding. So that's another reason we think why people are going to be joining these sector-wide collaborations to really put the rocket fuel into some of these solutions.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Will and Liz. And thanks also to a few questions that we've had come in during the webinar. So if it's all right, we'll kick off with a few follow-up questions. Will, going back to the first topic, where do you see air pollution legislation coming to the fore and why?
Sure. Well, I think we mentioned a little bit that Europe is leading the way here, especially where in cities, that's a real problem in major cities, London, Paris. We've seen low emission zones coming in. We've seen emissions limits on cars, and I think people are kind of aware of what PM 2.5 and things are now. This particulate matter that's generated from car tires is generated from exhaust, and it gets into your lungs and causes a whole host of respiratory problems. I think people are kind of aware of that now, and I think people's awareness is really pushing regulators in those areas to address it. I mean, let's not forget the UK has been taken to court by the EU several times because of its failure to deal with this problem. I don't know if Brexit will mean it will go one way or the other, but you can definitely see that people in the UK are not happy about this and want this addressed. We've mentioned a little bit about Asia as well, as particularly China. I think it's interesting that you can tie some of the efforts to reduce air pollution in with climate change efforts. So we see a lot of coal plants retiring, for example, and that has a kind of dual effect of lowering carbon emissions, but also has the impact of reducing the amount of smog and smoke in the air. I think those are kind of the two areas where we'll see a lot of drive. I think Liz mentioned a little bit about Africa earlier. I don't know if she'd want to expand on that.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think that vehicles, advanced fuel standards are going to be on the rise in Africa. We've started to see that. And I think that's an area that companies who have supply chains in Africa should be aware of. And then I think, sort of adding on to what Will just said about climate change, we're going to see that trickle-down effect as African countries start to rebuild their climate agendas for 2020.
Great. And I guess, Liz, just following on from that, Will's covered the pollution side. How do you see the plastic waste regulations kind of evolving in 2019?
I think this can be answered many different ways, but an area that I think will be prominent in 2019 and that we started to see last year is a focus on microplastics. I think that we saw the EU putting in a ban on microbeads in cosmetic and skincare. We're seeing it in the UK, in the US, even in Korea. So we're starting to see it pop up all over the globe. And I think that it's going to evolve. New Zealand's showing how it's going to evolve. They've just issued a ban on microplastics, not only in skincare, but in abrasive household and automobile and industrial cleaners. And then I think with the rise of sustainable fashion, there's going to be a focus on microfibers and sort of that release. And in that vein, there's also studies going on that are looking at the breakdown of ocean plastic into microplastics and its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And I think depending on what those studies find, we could see some regulations popping up from there.
Okay. And so I guess other than the kind of regulatory side of things, what's stopping us from kind of getting to grips with the circular economy?
Excuse me, I think there's a few things. Obviously, we mentioned a little bit about investment. I think the infrastructure question is a huge one. How do we actually deal with this? Is it being collected properly? Is it being dealt with properly? I think that's a real problem for not just Western nations, but also nations in Asia as well. And there's cultural issues as well. I think we have a lot of pushback from producers. Perhaps saying that this is a consumer problem. If consumers recycled bottles properly, then they wouldn't end up in the ocean. And there's definitely some validity to that. But equally, you have to look at the kind of scale of it, and we come back to the infrastructure bit as well. Even if they are putting them in the right bins, are they going to the right place? So I think there's a couple of issues there that are really struggling with the circular economy. And maybe, it's a difficult one to conceptualize. I think there's a lot of potential definitions of it. I think people have different ideas of what it means, everything from recycling to a kind of whole-scale restructuring of our economy to make sure that waste is an input as well as an output. And, ultimately, is it a sexy enough topic? Does it attract enough attention to kind of bring in the investment that it needs? I'm not sure that's always the case.
Well, I guess we'll leave that one there. Thank you, everyone, for sending in those questions. Will, I have one final question. It's my question, and I'm going to put you a little bit on the hot spot there. You've obviously worked really hard with the team to pick out these 4 topics for 2019. But if you were to look beyond 2019, are there any other risks that kind of further out companies should be wary of?
Gosh, yes. Thanks for that, Stacey. Yeah, I mean, obviously, one of the things we could have easily touched on is water risk. That's a huge issue every year. That's not going away. We expect climate change will make places that are arid even more arid. So that's going to be a problem for people as population expands and demand increases. And I think there's a number of other ones that are sort of bubbling under. We've seen a lot of reports just today about the kind of tipping points for biodiversity. of course, as a society, we derive an awful lot of value from natural capital. If that starts to disappear, how are we going to pollinate our plants? How are we going to create medicines? How are we going to do all these kind of things that we rely on the natural world for? So that's something I think that is coming forward a lot, and I would expect to see perhaps a bit more disclosure in company reports about their impact on biodiversity and how it affects them. Then I think you have particular sectors that I think are coming under focus as well. So we've seen a little bit of focus on the ICT sector, especially in terms of sourcing some of these minerals. We mentioned about illegal mining in places like the DRC. We know that there's connections there between the minerals that are pulled out of the ground there and the smartphone that's in your pocket. And areas like food production as well. We've seen a lot of focus in the past 6 months or so on meat production and how producing beef can be very bad for the environment in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. I know there's still some debate around the exact kind of figures on that, but I think there's a consensus that it can be kind of damaging in terms of creating deforestation and also just the emissions from livestock themselves. So I think there's kind of pressure on companies who source those kind of commodities to really look at their value chains and how they're addressing it. And maybe even further down the line, potentially shifting away from meat. There's a lot of popularity for meat-free diets. We saw there's a number of companies like Beyond Meat who create that burger that has no meat in it. There was an IPO, or there was planned to be an IPO anyway, for that company, and we can see, a lot of interest in that sector. Of course, lab-grown meat has its own kind of health and safety and environmental risks as well, but that's something I think that we'll be keeping an eye on over the next year or so.
Well, Will, I don't know if it's because you're in New York and it's lunchtime, but if you wanted to end on a nice kind of food example, but that's probably a nice place to wrap up. Thank you very much for kind of sharing your views on these issues with us. They're obviously not going away. They've captured the attention of consumers and regulators, media, business has started to take action against their exposure and like you mentioned, even their perceived exposure. So it'll be really interesting to see how regulators and businesses continue to kind of drive forward the action to kind of resolve some of these challenges. And thank you to everyone who was able to attend this webinar today. We'll follow up with you with the Environmental Risk Outlook and recording of this webinar if you have ticked a box that says we are allowed to do so. Again, if you missed that note at the very beginning of the call, if you tick do not email on anything, given our new GDPR regulation, we can't send that information to you. If you would like this information, just email me at info@maplecroft.com. And also just to note, we'll be hosting our final 2 ERO webinars, the 2020 targets and the climate change disclosure gap, next week on the 6th and 7th of March. And we hope you can join us then. Until then, thanks very much, Will and Liz.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank
Bye.
you.